What makes an artist good is something that we contemplate as artists, especially when you're an aspiring artist and you're just starting out your journey. Now, I've been a drawing teacher for quite some time now, and I've seen a lot of artists go through this journey and go from being in a situation where they can't draw very well to the point where they're getting jobs, they're gainfully employed, and they're able to create the work that they want. Now, I don't really believe in the concept of talent. I'm much more aligned with the idea of a lot of hard work being the key to getting good at art. And I think I've never seen anyone get really, really good without putting in a huge amount of effort. But there are a number of things that I think we could easily define as talents because different artists find some areas of the artistic journey harder than others. What I want to do in this video is discuss what I've seen as the 5 main talents that really will help you out as an artist. Now, I don't want to talk about these as some sort of talent that you either have or you don't have. Rather, I think these are things that some people are good at naturally and some are not. But in all cases, these are probably things that we should all work on and we should all aim to get better at. And where relevant, I'll discuss and share with you some books, resources, or quick tips for how you can build these essential elements that I think are really, really important for all great artists. Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for 20 years. When I started out, it certainly felt like I had no talent at all, and it's taken me a lot of time to get to a point where I'm comfortable in my career and I'm sort of able to do the things that I want. And as I said, I've spent a lot of time mentoring and teaching artists throughout this journey. So I've had a good chance to see the different elements that can sort of affect people's performance, let's say. And what we're all about on this channel is drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you're interested, you can check out my free mini illustration workshop. In that workshop, I go over how I got to be a professional artist and draw comics professionally, do concept art professionally, coming from someone who didn't have a lot of good resources. Essentially, I had to teach myself. And in that workshop, I talk about this. And I also give you a few tips if you're interested in illustration and picture making about how to get more detail and polish in your work and how to think about sort of moving towards getting professional work and just what you need to do and think about to make that happen. It's free. The link will be in the description. Go check it out. All right. So before we get sort of stuck into these sort of talents that I think are really important, it's probably also important to sort of cover a lot of the discussion that tends to flow around the idea of talent versus sort of, sweat and hard work and, elbow grease. Malcolm Gladwell classically wrote Outliers, which is where the concept of the 10,000 hour rule was first really popularized, at least for me. A lot of people have attacked that idea in the past, and people tend to sort of write and make YouTube videos discussing this concept. From my sort of personal experience and everything I've seen, the 10,000 hours seems pretty reasonable as a thesis. People tend to sort of discuss and debate the details of it. And the other thing that you're likely to see where people say it's not going to take 10,000 hours, it's not going to take heaps of time, is people trying to sell you a shortcut, which I just don't think is going to work. But as I said, there are talents and there are things that people come out of the factory built with that can really help. And I think it can either be really useful for you to know whether you have these talents, in which case you should leverage and sort of capitalize on them, or if you don't, in which case, again, for most of these, for me, I really did not have a lot of basic drawing talent. I had a few of these that are not sort of specific drawing talents, but I had to build on them. I had to work on them myself. And if you know that they're things that maybe you don't have that are going to be really, really important, then it's worthwhile thinking about these and developing them on your own. So the first talent is related to Betty Edwards drawing on the right side of the brain, and that is that some artists just seem to be able to draw what they see with very little interference. Now, if you read this book, and this book is, funnily enough, is the answer to this problem, if you're not one of those people who can just sort of draw what you see in front of you. This book will help you with that. It has a lot of really good practical advice. And I am terrible at drawing what I see in front of me, which is lucky because I just want to draw stuff from my head, from my imagination. And I've never been very good at drawing that stuff. But I have noticed that some people just seem to be good at this and some people don't. And I don't think this is necessarily also just a matter of practice. I think this is something you can see early on. And essentially, if you read that book and sort of look at a lot of what's happening when people are sort of ineffective at drawing what's in front of them, just doing sort of still life work or, figure drawing, is that often the iconographic and symbolic version of all the objects that we see in the world is kind of interfering with what we are actually seeing. So the classic example of this is that, you might be looking at a portrait and you see an eye. Now, the eye, depending on the angle, is going to be a very specific shape, right? It's curved, it has form, it has dimension. But often the eye that we draw, right, is that sort of eye of Horus eye, right? The iconographic eye, the eye that's kind of just straight on with a sort of the center of the eye in the middle. And what's happening there is that your sort of symbolic iconographic understanding of the world is interfering with what you actually see. And a lot of, again, what you will sort of build on by sort of going down the path of trying to correct that is just getting good at looking at what is actually there and perceiving the abstract nature of it. As opposed to thinking, oh, I'm drawing an arm, you sort of start to say, I'm just drawing the negative space within the arm. And you just start to see patterns of sort of light and dark and all of these different elements. Now, once you get really good at that, and this is one of the things, is that often people are good at drawing what they see. To be really good, you also need to understand what you're seeing and to be able to break it down so that you can simplify it and abstract it and make it better. So even though this is a talent, and it often helps people, especially in sort of the early levels of art education, it's not necessarily a great path to making great art. The great sort of representational painters both are able to, draw exactly what is in front of them, but they're able to make it better. They understand the forms that are going on there, and they can simplify them, they can adjust them, they can accentuate them. They can create a version of reality that is actually better than the version that is sort of in front of you. And again, it's this sort of talent that I think it's important to understand that, again, you might just be good at this in the beginning, in which case it seems like sort of you're better than other people at drawing. Watch out that you don't get sort of pushed down this path unless you specifically just want to create a career out of drawing what you see. Because again, if you do want to draw from your imagination, or you want to become, someone who's actually adding to that reality that you see in front of you, you're going to need to build your art foundation anyway and learn about all of the other things that everyone does well. And that's going to take you, a huge amount of time and effort. And, again, we've got photos now. So, just being able to sort of copy what's in front of you, even though it's really, really important as a skill, some people are good at it, some people are not. It's not something that's really going to make a huge difference. But again, it is something that surprisingly some of us struggle with and some of us don't. The second thing here that I think is very, very hard to teach and almost like, really something that I can't offer a lot of good advice on is design sense. Some people just seem to be really good at gauging proportion and understanding the abstract elements of art. This is where, again, they just will tend to wear clothes that look good. If you give them a set of objects, they'll be able to arrange them nicely. These are people with rooms that just kind of look and feel nice. Everything's kind of placed in a good position. There's a good combination of textures and colors. They just seem to have a good handle on how to create, a version of the world that is kind of nice and abstractly pleasing. This is one of the hardest things to train and teach because it's about decision making. And it is honestly, something where you really just have to try and get better at this by sheer force, by just immersing yourself in good visual environments. And I think that that can play a huge role in it. And a lot of these things are not necessarily something that I'm saying is a genetic talent gift. This could be something that, again, you're just built with. It could be something that you develop in your sort of younger years. But these are all things that, by the time someone is really starting to consider art as a profession or getting really serious about it, you either are going to have this kind of skill set or not. And again, this is something where you may have to really sort of dig deep and understand and look at the concepts of sort of design and abstract sort of just picture making and visual interest, right? This is where a lot of those sort of more foundational concepts of composition that underlie sort of architecture, fashion design, interior design, everything. There's a lot of underlying basic, how do we make people happy? How do we sort of design things that look good? It's really good to study nature in this instance and sort of understand how those things are put together, and just a lot of really, really basic concepts like repeating patterns, shapes, whether or not they're sort of aggressive or soft, and how to sort of manipulate that, get a good balance, again, light versus dark, colorful versus not colorful, again, how different textural sort of elements go together. It could be that this is one of those talents that's just built from people being quite sensitive to these elements and visual things in the beginning. The more sensitive to these things you are, the more sort of interested you are in them, the more you tend to pay attention to other things. Again, the more you care about visual design. So it's a tricky one, and you may have it or you may not. It's very, very hard if you just have no design sense to kind of, just sort of make stuff look good. And it can be very frustrating when, again, you just kind of give, any old thing to someone and they just kind of put it together and, or they just kind of always make stuff look good. Just one of those tricky things, but I think this really is one of the closest things to a true talent that can exist. Some people just know how to make stuff look good. The third thing is a photographic memory, or at least an enhanced ability to sort of visualize the world and memorize it. Now, this is something that I definitely don't have. I've never had, and some people have it. Probably, on a spectrum or a scale, right? It's not that you either have one or you don't, but some people are much better at just remembering the things they see. And because the idea of visual library is so important to artists, what you find is this makes a huge difference to someone's ability to, sort of remember little details and put them into their art. So it'll help them with that first thing, right? The idea of drawing what you see, because you'll be able to kind of see stuff in your head a lot better and then draw that. So I think this is one of those things, again, that is probably, some either genetic or developmental thing where some people are kind of just built that way. They, photographically memorize things, and they have a good sort of ability to recall those and potentially spin them around in their head and sort of visualize them. Again, this could have sort of, detrimental effects on their artistic development in other areas. It's hard to say, but this is one of those things that, again, if you don't have it, it can be very frustrating. And really, the only sort of antidote to this, if you don't have a really good sort of photographic memory, is to just know and understand how you're going to process and how the process for your images is going to unfold. And a lot of people, again, will build reference libraries so that they have a good system and a good way to kind of find that reference when they need it, knowing when you need to find that reference for your art, and how you sort of integrate it, how you make that kind of, fit your entire sort of artistic workflow for a particular image can be really useful. But yeah, again, don't be surprised if you're someone who doesn't have any sort of ability to memorize things, but your friend who's a good artist as well might just be able to recall things and draw stuff from memory. Can be really, really tricky to know sort of where you sit, but I think this is definitely one of those talents that some people have and some people don't. All right, so those previous three are really what I consider the three core talents that are kind of like physical things that people just kind of tend to have. Like if I have a bunch of students, right, some will just be really, really good at something and they can't explain it. It's not like, they spent heaps of work and time doing this. It's just kind of there, and it's just something they're actually doing well. These last two are a little bit more sort of on the mental side or the philosophical side. And the first of these, so the fourth talent, is just kind of having a little bit more of an artistic right brain dominance. So again, you can sort of, you've probably heard the drawing on the right side of the brain, right left brain dominance. So typically, again, your right brain dominance is going to be the more sort of creative. It's the less talky, right? It's the less cerebral. It's the more intuitive. And I think that basically a lot of people can just think about this too much. And what you'll find is that getting good at art is not an intellectual game. It's not necessarily a knowledge acquisition game. Logic doesn't always help you. A lot of it is, just being really good at understanding, how the artistic visual side of things work. And again, I've seen a lot of students who just sort of tend to be, again, a little bit more cerebral, really struggle with many, many elements of developing their artistic career and potential, because they tend to try and think it through, and they need sort of reasons why, they need logical reasons. And again, there's good sort of outcomes for people who are very cerebral and can master the artistic side of their sort of journey, because then you have a really good sense of design as well, right? You can kind of think through the drawing problem, and other people really struggle with that. But this is one of those things where, I've seen people just sort of cruise through a lot of sort of drawing exercises, a lot of their sort of foundational knowledge, because they just kind of do it and they just sort of don't worry about it too much. So a lot of that sort of flow state, and again, we don't necessarily have to think precisely about right left brain dominance. Again, from a scientific point of view, that stuff's still up in the air. But the point here is, again, more flow state, less intellectualizing, more just doing it, being able to respond to different things that are happening, not sort of freezing up and getting into that sort of editing mindset. Some people just come out of the factory really good at that, and some people really have to work on that. So this is where, again, I think a lot of what you can potentially do is work on just, trying to meditate on the fact that being intelligent and being able to think through a lot of these problems doesn't often help you. Again, it's not often about why with art. It's often just a matter of sort of doing it, being a little bit more intuitive. And even though, as I said, you want both of these things to work well, it can be very, very frustrating. I've seen a lot of people get derailed completely because, they're just overthinking it and they can't just relax into the process and just get a little bit more of that natural artistic mind happening early on. Probably a good book that is something that kind of talks to this is The Art of Learning by Joshua Waitzkin. I think that's a really great book that talks about the philosophy of sort of learning, and again, learning very physical things, right? Things which are not necessarily 100% logical. So Joshua Waitzkin was sort of a chess champion and then did some sort of physical martial arts, and that book sort of talks about the relationships between those. And I think the key there is often, again, he's really discussing the concepts of sort of logical analysis versus intuitive analysis, and how you really get sort of good at things and get to a high level of performance. So it's a fascinating book, and maybe that sort of thing can help you sort of intellectualize the process of sort of letting go and handling mastery via intuition to a certain degree. Again, to put a very complicated, good book into simple terms. So I recommend checking that out, or any other books that really talk about this idea of what it means to, again, focus on physical crafts and the mentalities and the attitudes that you might need to employ there. Again, I think art has a lot more in common with sport, dance, and martial art from a practical application and learning sort of approach that you need to take, rather than an intellectual sort of, math, science sort of approach. So keep that in mind and look for books that sort of discuss this paradigm. The fifth and last thing that, again, is a little bit more of a mental side and is probably something that is learnt, and you bring as baggage with you is the idea that some people are just good at art because they have a positive relationship to that art, i.e., they just sit down and do it and they're relatively happy doing it. And I think this can often be a major benefit, right? It's essentially a talent, because if you have this positive attitude towards your art, then you tend to just sit down and do it. And then the more you do it and the more you're positive about it and the less you're kind of sitting there, sort of like wringing your hands and, worrying about it and stressing out, the more you're likely to get into a state of flow, the more you're likely to build like a positive sort of feedback loop, where again, the better you feel about it, the more work you do, the more work you do, the better you get, the better you get, the better you feel about it, the better you feel about it, the more you do about it, etc., right? And again, I know that's not where a lot of artists come from, but it is something where I've seen, people who just are kind of happy doing their art. It's a lot easier for them to put in their 10,000 hours or 20,000 hours or 5,000 hours or however long it sort of takes them to get to where they want to be. Now, I think this is, again, one of those concepts that you can sort of work on. And a lot of it goes back to, again, many things I've sort of talked about on this channel. I think it's really important to get your sort of motivation sorted, your inspiration sorted, and to really figure out like who to listen to. So the areas where I find this happens the most is, again, someone will come sort of out of high school into sort of a university or college grade sort of art education. And again, a lot of people have put a lot of ideas into their head. And, a lot of them are like negative, right? It's often we come from a pass-fail, sort of testing modality when it comes to education normally. And a lot of people are very afraid, very fearful, and they sort of don't want to do the wrong thing. As opposed to, again, people are just kind of sitting down drawing because they, like drawing. And I think, it's very easy sort of if you don't have that talent of just, liking to draw, let's say, that you don't spend as much time on things. And it's harder for you to sort of sit down because you're sort of worried about maybe the things that you're doing being wrong, etc. Now, again, the solution to this is just to understand the fact that, a lot of those negative sort of editing ideas aren't always going to help you when you're in your creation mode. And if, alternatively, you're just someone who's very critical. Again, I'm one of these people. I'm sort of very critical of sort of, everything. And I think there's a degree to where some level of criticism is really useful for your work. The way I often describe it is you have a blank page, right? And I'm going to criticize that blank page because it has nothing on it. And as I try and create an image on that blank page, I'm trying to improve it. And I'm being critical about, the way that it could be better. So we're trying to improve things. In order to make something better, you need to figure out what's wrong with it. So these things go hand in hand. The key is not to let the sort of negative feelings or the editing side of it sort of stop you creating. You need to sort of compartmentalize your process. You need to make sure that when you're creating, you're really in a nice flow state. You're really in a good creative mindset. And if you are just naturally critical, then, sort of separate that process out and make sure you just promise to yourself that you'll do it later. And the more you do that, the better you get at kind of just sitting down and positively drawing. Alternatively, if you had a whole bunch of people tell you that, again, you really like to draw manga or something like that, this is the classic one that happens, and you just had everyone in your life telling you that that is just a terrible idea, it looks bad, you'll never make any money doing it, it's crap art, etc., 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 right? A lot of it is just, doing the work to, get those demons out of your mind and just, like forget about those things and figure out who you want to listen to. And again, building your own little reality about what the value of yourself and your art is. I know that's a little bit deep, but again, I think that's often where we need to go. Because if you don't enjoy doing art and you don't just enjoy sitting down and sort of the pleasure of getting into flow, then you're going to do less drawing than the next person who has that sort of natural ability. And again, this can often be frustrating to people, both of these two last things. the idea of sort of being too intellectual, right? Being too critical. You kind of need these things, and they can be useful. But if you let them run the show, they can derail your entire journey. And it's often frustrating to see people who are kind of just sort of blindly, happily drawing away, getting really, really, really good, and getting to the point where like their art is just so good that everyone sort of starts to it's almost like they don't need to do those other things. They don't need to be intellectual about it because their art is just so good. But that's the reality, right? Anything that stops you from doing it and stops you enjoying it and just sort of, rolling with it and having a positive experience with it, getting that feedback loop happening, getting that creation loop happening, anything that stops you doing that is going to be the opposite of a talent in art. Anyway, that's it for this one. The three main talents are just being able to draw what you see in front of you, not having anything interfere with that. The second is having a good design sense, having a good ability to just create nice things at an abstract level. And the third is having a good photographic memory, which helps you with visual library. Those are the three main sort of talents that I see people have. And again, I think there's a lot of good techniques and strategies you can use to get better at all of those if you sort of, are maybe lacking or want to work on those. And the last two, the more sort of psychological things, are just naturally having a good artistic mindset, right? Not necessarily going into the editing, not worrying about things too much, just being able to sort of go into flow, being a little bit less cerebral, a little bit less analytical, less asking why and, getting frustrated if you don't get a good answer, just kind of doing it. And the last thing, as I just said, is having a good positive relationship to art, which again, we all should have, but maybe we don't for various reasons. And either way, it is worth putting in the effort to make sure that you solve that problem. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments or things I can follow up with in the comments below, and we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.